Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to our webinar on implementing strategies to reduce or eliminate the use of timeout rooms in Massachusetts schools. We are thrilled that there is such tremendous interest in this topic, which is dear to our heart, and that we were able to pull this together in a very short time period. My name is Stephanie Krantz. I'm a senior attorney at the Disability Law Center, and I'm very grateful for my team that helped put this together. That includes Tim Sindelar, Senior Counsel at the Ed Law Project, Iman Hassan, Director of the Stop the School to Prison Pipeline at Massachusetts Advocates for Children, and Emily Lamarca, an exceptional parent advocate and critical part of our team. Law Center, who did all the registration as well as the technical setup. A few housekeeping tips. This event will be recorded and we have CART captioning. We planned for an hour and are hoping to have a short Q&A at the end. If you feel free to put questions in the chat and we will get to what time permits, and what we can't get to, we will hopefully connect and follow up after the event. So on January 22nd, DESE released an important grant as a resource for public and private approved schools to obtain funding to reduce or eliminate timeout rooms in Massachusetts schools. Applications are due February 20th. As an overview, the grant can be used for high-quality professional development, implementation of restorative practices, behavioral support teams, parent and community engagement, data collection and evaluation, and physical changes and resources in schools. Today, we have 6 highly knowledgeable and accomplished professionals who will share their approaches to working with schools on these topics. I want to note that these alternative approaches have been successful for children with all types of disabilities and in all types of schools, including public and private approved schools. While there are many professionals working on these issues locally, nationally, and internationally, we thought it would be helpful to share a sampling to get the ball rolling. We've also attached some additional vendor resources at the end of our slideshow. We ask that all attendees mute and turn their cameras off to allow the recording to highlight the speaker. And again, thank you for joining us today, and we will move to our first speaker.
Thank you. I have the pleasure of introducing a really great panel here today, and I think that you'll agree that this is an exciting opportunity. Our first presenter is Dr. Laurie DeSatels. Dr. Satels has been the assistant professor at Butler University since 2016, where she teaches in the College of Education. She's been also an assistant professor at Marian University in Indianapolis, and while there founded the Educational Neuroscience Symposium that's now reached thousands of educators and is in its 16th year. Dr. DeSatels created the Applied Educational Neuroscience Certification, which is specifically designed to meet the needs of educators, counselors, clinicians, and administrators who work besides children and adolescents who are experiencing adversity and trauma. The certification is now global and has reached hundreds of educators. Laurie is the author of 4 books with more to come. Her newest book will be a manual coming out in 2024 entitled Body and Brain Brilliance, a manual to cultivating awareness and practices for our nervous system. Laurie has met with well over 200 school districts across the country and in Canada, Costa Rica, Australia, Scotland, England, and Dubai, equating to more than 150,000 educators with much more work to be done. Dr. DeSatels.
Thank you so much. That was such a kind introduction, and I just feel so grateful to have the opportunity in 5 to 7 minutes to really be a part of this movement. And I think we are in a meaning crisis. This is a movement, and our children need us, our families need us. And so I'm going to begin. I'm going to be talking today, next slide. I'm going to be talking today about the 4 pillars of applied educational neuroscience. These pillars blend and lean into each other. It is a tier 1 trauma accommodating, restorative, and equitable framework that supports me personally as much as it does professionally. When I go into the schools working with organizations or schools and districts, it's just not about us as educators or clinicians, we take this with us. We carry in who we are. We carry in our trauma. We carry in histories of how we were disciplined, which we rarely explore. And that's something that I think about as a mom of 3 adult children and now a new grandma. So these 4 pillars, the adult nervous system, educator nervous system, is a real shift, because we are learning and have learned, and the research is burgeoning, that behavior management is about the adults. And even in my own district, yesterday at 4 o'clock, when I went in to talk with the elementary school where I'm going in 2 days a week, there's a lot of resistance with educators right now, because none of us were trained or prepared to really understand what's underneath the behavior, and that it really is about getting in front of our own behavior. Co-regulation is who we are. We are social, communal creatures, and we can't survive without each other. And connection is at the heart and needs to be at the heart of discipline. When I think about timeout rooms, because I am a former special education teacher, I taught children with the classification of emotionally disturbed, behavior disordered. I was a resource teacher, self-contained, but in the early 90s, timeout rooms were really all we knew. And what we now understand is that the antithesis of connection is isolation. It goes against our biology. Seclusion and restraint go against our biology. So co-regulation isn't rewarding negative behavior. It is, when I go into the schools, I am sharing that I need to be aware of my nervous system so that I can share a little bit of that calm, steadiness, groundedness with those children or my colleagues who need it. Touch points are those micro moments of connection, oftentimes nonverbal. And then you can see the leaves have changed on the tree, because we're done talking about behavior. This is just hundreds of years old. And we know that a behavior is a signal. It is a code. It's an indicator that the nervous system, as we say in our house, is rough. We'll go to the next one. This is my lab. I am in the classroom. I don't know what I would have to say to anybody if I were not back in the classroom. 11 years ago, I asked for a course release, and these are my rock star teachers that I co-teach with 2 days a week. And I'm learning every day. Next slide. I am now in 5th grade. I started in January. And one of the practices that I want to share that this framework is about is getting out in front of the student's behavior. That's the work. This work is in our procedures. It is in our routines. It is in our transitions. And so when I met my 5th grade students this year, and this is what I'm sharing everywhere, is that we've got to be intentional, not only about our nervous systems, but instead of always consequencing and reacting, we have to get in front of that. And it's built into what we're already doing. We're not adding to an educator's plate. Next slide. So the 4 shifts that really drive this framework, personally and professionally, are getting out in front of our own behaviors, really paying attention of how do our procedures, our routines, our transitions, and how we exit the day, how are those building engagement, strengthening our executive functions, dampening down the stress response systems, and being very relational and preventative so that we begin to diminish those behaviors that we call oppositional, defiant, disrespectful, shutdown. It's also looking beneath the behavior. And the 4th one is huge. And I've learned this at Belzer Middle School in Indianapolis, where I've spent the last 2 years with 7th graders. And that is, a lot of adults are frustrated in buildings because there is not building-wide predictability and consistency with procedures that are trauma accommodating. And next slide. I hope I'm not going over my time. This is what drives the work. This is the polyvagal graph, which shares our nervous system. And we're teaching this to 4- and 5-year-olds. I'm teaching this to adults. I'm learning every day, and we check in with our nervous systems, learning about our ands, which is our autonomic nervous system, and really talking about how it is so celebratory and so normal to be in fight flight in the red. We've pathologized that for so long. And I want our students and I want my teachers and adults to know that the nervous system is always working for us and not against us. And when we mobilize energy for fight flight, or we feel ourselves disconnect, that is our body telling us how we need to resource ourselves. Next slide. So I want to end this presentation with this question. We often think of discipline referrals as an indicator of student behavior, but could discipline referrals be an indicator of staff behavior? Are we seeing the same classrooms and educators suspend, kick out, refer out, implement some very punitive discipline protocols? Because that is all we really have been trained to understand and know. But this is a shift, and the pandemic has opened this up for us. Next slide. So when we think about isolating and timeouts in our classrooms, we are almost always timing out trauma logic. And trauma logic is what a student carries in a very protective and survival instinct, and punishing these only reinforces them. It's logical to run out of a room where you have grown up in an environment that people have been hurtful to you. It's logical to shut down and disconnect when you have felt overwhelmed in the environment that's been a part of your biology. So isolation, chronic unpredictability, and physical and emotional restraint wreak havoc on the developing nervous system. We can take a lot. Our nervous systems are built to wobble. They're not built to break. But this we can't take. And this is what we as adults can begin to mitigate and to begin to repair in our schools. I think that's my last one. Oh, it's okay. I think I've gone over my time, but it's about the adult nervous system. That's this work. It's about us being aware and recognizing our sensations, our feelings, and really knowing how contagious our emotions and our stress responses are. This is a part of the new manual that's coming out this year.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. DeSattel. So we really appreciate this information. I'm pleased to announce our next speakers, Dr. Stuart Ablon, who is the director of Think Kids in the Department of Psychiatry at Massachusetts General Hospital, who's also an associate professor and the Thomas G. Stenberg Endowed Chair in Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. He's the author of 3 books, including The School Discipline Fix, Changing Behavior Through Collaborative Problem-Solving Approach. Dr. Ablon has helped hundreds of schools throughout the world implement the evidence-based collaborative problem-solving approach as an equitable alternative to traditional school discipline. Dr. Ablon, we're really pleased to have you here.
Thank you very much, Tim. I appreciate it. And thank you at the outset here to the DLC, to the Ed Law Project, and to Mass Advocates for bringing us all together. I'm pleased to be here. So if we can advance the slides here, that would be great. There we go. You can move to the next slide as well. Thank you. So we do work all over the world, but actually I think important to kick this off by saying that we are local. We are based right here, as you've heard, in Boston at Mass General Hospital. And our team, we have a team of about 30 staff members, and many of them have roots right here in Boston and in Massachusetts. Our trainers have deep experience working with districts across the state, alongside our project managers who are local and work in the local systems. In fact, many of us, myself included, are products of Massachusetts public school system, and also, like myself, have kids in the public school systems in Massachusetts as well. So we're quite invested here locally. Next slide, please. And this is just an example of some of the schools that we have deeper partnerships with and have worked with over time. So we have a lot of experience working in Massachusetts. We teach an approach called collaborative problem solving. Next slide. And you may be familiar with it, or perhaps you've heard about collaborative problem solving because it was named recently as one of 2 really approved alternative remedies by DESE in the new legislation governing suspension and expulsion. So you saw collaborative problem solving and restorative practices mentioned as alternatives. And we think collaborative problem solving is a great solution to the problem that we're here talking about today. But I do want to point out something, which is that we don't like to implement collaborative problem solving explicitly to try to eliminate things like timeout rooms or suspension, detention, et cetera. But instead, our focus is trying to help educators better understand and more effectively respond to concerning behavior. And what we've been able to show is that when you do that, you dramatically reduce and even eliminate the use of things like timeout rooms. But it happens as a byproduct of understanding that challenging behavior is about skill, not will, and that these students, they're not lacking the will to behave better. What they lack are the skills to behave better. And we need to empower our educators to have other tools to use, because traditional approaches to progressive discipline not only don't work, but they often make matters worse and often, in fact, trigger the very behavior that they are trying to prevent. But I have learned over a few decades now doing this that you can't tell people to stop using something without giving them something else actionable to do instead that they feel confident in and engaged in using. So next slide. I think right now there's just a massive contagion of dysregulation everywhere in our schools coming out of the pandemic. It's one of the most pressing issues, and collaborative problem solving is a solution that anybody in a school can implement: classroom teachers, paraprofessionals, administrators, and it provides actionable things for people to do and a clear structure to follow. So it helps people move from theory to action. And our research has shown it strengthens relationships, it improves school climate, helps kids and adults, as you heard in the last presentation is so crucial, build emotion regulation skills, social thinking skills, all kinds of neurocognitive skills. And yes, indeed, we can go to the next slide here, reduces or eliminates the use of timeout rooms. So what does collaborative problem solving provide? Well, it provides an empirically validated assessment tool so educators can quickly identify the skills that students are struggling with that lead to their challenging behaviors and predict the triggers to them, a simple framework for behavior intervention planning, and then a 3-step problem solving process that decreases these behaviors while building relationships and skills. Next slide, please. We see pretty dramatic results in terms of reduction in office referrals, in things like restraints, seclusions, timeouts. In the middle here, you see a graph that shows a 200% change in students sent out of classroom for discipline during the pandemic. We see emotional safety increase sizably as well. Next slide. I think many people on this webinar have great reason to be really concerned about the degree of stress that our educators are feeling these days. We see reductions in teacher stress in addition to reduction in student behavior. We also see significant jumps in student attendance, which is something we all need to be concerned about as well. Next slide, please. Sorry to race here, but want to fit a few other things in the brief time. Collaborative problem solving is also a trauma-informed approach. I'm fortunate to do a lot of work with a good friend and colleague, Dr. Bruce Perry, who's a noted trauma researcher, and he's very fond of this approach because, in essence, what it does is it operationalizes basic principles of being trauma-informed and trauma-sensitive, which, most schools are trained in the principles, but how do you take those principles and make them actionable, especially in the face of concerning behavior? That's one of the strengths of this approach. Next slide, please. The other thing that we're really excited about is that collaborative problem solving is showing promise when it comes to not only interrupting explicit biases about behavior, like that it's willful, but also implicit biases about behavior that lead to the disproportionality in school discipline that we see, particularly when it comes to students of color, students with disabilities, and students with trauma histories. Next slide, please. We do have a curriculum. It's called the School Discipline Fix, and we have a number of supports that educators can use to help them to be able to practice and implement the approach successfully with fidelity. And my last slide here, as I mentioned at the outset, we work with lots of districts across Massachusetts and beyond. We can provide professional development so all staff can learn this. We provide group coaching so that people can improve their practice after training, because one thing we know, spray and pray training does not work. Coaching is essential. And we also provide consultation to leaders in terms of how to implement these strategies. And we have a certification program where you can certify people within your district so they can be experts, they can be your culture carriers, and they can be doing the training internally for sustainability reasons. So thanks so much for having me. I'm honored to be a part of this group, and would love to have some discussions with folks who might be interested following the webinar. Thank you, Tim. Thank
you very much, Dr. Owen. Really appreciate it. Our next presenter is Kim Sanders, who's the Chief Operating Officer at Grafton Integrated Health Network and the president of Ukuru Systems. Kim has been working at Grafton for over 35 years. She started as a direct support professional, moved into a regional executive director position, and currently is the Chief Operating Officer and the president of Ukuru Systems. She spearheaded the effort at Grafton to reduce restraint and seclusion and has received many national and international recognitions and awards. She's one of the inventors of Ukuru, the least resistance approach to crisis management. Kim, thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. It's wonderful to be a part of this today. I really appreciate it. So let's talk about Ukuru, this word. This was a Japanese word to mean receive. So next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about Grafton. So we're sitting here in Winchester, Virginia. We're a private nonprofit behavioral healthcare company. We do psychiatric residential treatment, therapeutic day schools, early intervention, some outreach programs as well. So next slide, please. What I like to start with is telling you where we were, because we're a provider. We're still working with kids every day right here and our sites across the country, and it's tough. And again, as Tim mentioned, I started here in 1989 when I was 19 years old. I worked my first 5 years direct care. And as been previously mentioned, back in the 90s in particular, it was thought that the use of restraint and seclusion, timeouts, were just normal. That's just what you had to do. And so you can see sort of the good, bad, and the ugly here about where we were as an organization through the 90s and into the early 2000s. I show this definitely not with any sense of pride, but rather to give a picture of where we were and hopefully to give a little hope that things can get better. So what we did here at Grafton is through the 90s, we became exceptionally controlling. And where that got us is we had this mindset that in order to work with and educate students who had challenging behaviors, that we really had no choice but to use this whole toolbox of restrictive practices. Where that landed us in 2003, as you can see, serving over 220 individuals, we did over 6,600 restraints and 1,500 seclusions. And what was so telling was our workforce was being injured more. The more controlling we were, the more injured our workforce was, to the point at some point during that time period, we lost our workers' compensation insurance. So the other thing that happened, we had high turnover, about 54% turnover. So this sort of constant churn of our workforce. We had silos being created, which people didn't like each other in different departments, didn't work well together. And we sort of had this undertone of our culture of being helpless, hopeless victims. And it really got to a point that if we didn't make some change, an organization, which at that time was about a $40 million organization, was going to go out of business. And so, next slide, please. What happened is a lot of these sort of like bad things were happening, wheels coming off the wagon, sort of. And we got a new CEO who really pushed us to think out of the box and do something different. And he issued a mandate in the summer of 2004 to decrease the use of restraint and seclusion without an increase to staff or student injury. Next slide, please. So here's what happened. A group of us got together, people who were teachers, direct care staff, people who were like living it, doing it every day. And we started talking about, like, we're good people. We're not bad people. Why are we using all of this restraint and seclusion? Why are children getting hurt? Why are we being injured so bad? And then what we came up with, it was out of fear and frustration. That number one fear, if you have been hit, kicked, bit, you've had a violent episode, you're scared. So what happens when we get scared? Our own amygdalas are sort of on fire and we jump to things that we probably shouldn't. So I can speak from my own experience working direct care. I know I did restraints and seclusions well before or quicker than any policy Grafton said I should. And again, I did that out of fear. I'm not a mean person. I didn't want to hurt people. The other thing is it's a fear that you don't want a kid to hurt another kid or your coworker to get hurt. Then the other side of that is frustration. We started talking about frustration, and what's so funny is it wasn't about the frustration with the students. It was frustration around bureaucracy, not enough resources, not seeing our supervisors, those types of operational things. And so what we wanted to do was create something that could, number one, protect and help our employees. Now, I know that's not always popular when I first say it. Please know, our mission, we're a nonprofit serving children and adults. Our mission are students and making sure that they are well educated and safe. But we had to realize until we started taking care of our staff and making them feel safe, they weren't going to be able to do all the wonderful things with the kids. And so what we did is we tackled the fear by creating a very defensive blocking system. And then we tackled the frustration by, number one, trying to flip our culture around how we treated each other and how we treated those in direct care and teaching types of positions who are working directly with the students. So we infused trauma-informed practices for everyone. And we created this philosophy we call comfort versus control, which is basically understanding how to respond when someone's having a super bad day. And then we started layering on a bunch of proactive things because, as people have said, of course, we don't want it. We want blocking now to be our last resort, and we want to do everything we can not to get there. So we put a plan together and it worked. Next slide, please. So you can see our results here across Grafton. We've reduced our restraints by 99.6%. We have areas where we started that have been completely restraint-free for like 8 years. We ended seclusion across our entire organization about 10 years ago. Our staff injuries took a deep dive. And the crazy thing is, when all of that started happening, what went up? Goal mastery. And if you were to ask people who were here during this whole journey, they would say it went up because now we actually get to teach and we get to work on goals with kids because we're not spending all of our time, doing restrictive practices or sitting out in the hall with kids. The other cool thing is we've been able to recapture about $21 million through this initiative with savings in workers' comp and turnover. Next slide, please. So that word started getting out. Where we are today, UKERU is a division of the nonprofit Grafton. We're in about 650 organizations and schools. We have about 51% of our customers are schools. And we're in 47 states now, District of Columbia, Canada, New Zealand, and we need to add Brazil. So that's UKERU. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Kim. We appreciate that. This is the effort to appropriately address difficult behavior and help students is not just a national effort, as you can see from several presenters across the country here, but it's international. Our next speaker is Gareth Morwood. Gareth is the Educational Advisor for Student 3. He has previously worked for 25 years in United Kingdom schools. 17 years of those 25 were in inclusive secondary schools in the northwest of England. Gareth has extensive frontline experience supporting schools, and families, and worked with young people in the United Kingdom and in Chile, Dubai, Portugal, Ireland, and Scandinavia. Gareth is the co-director of the LASER program, which fuses his critically acclaimed saturation model with low arousal approaches as part of a system-led model of inclusive practice. As a visiting lecturer, Gareth has taught on postgraduate courses teaching non-adverse approaches supporting people with complex needs. And he's also just published a new book, Championing Your Autistic Team at Secondary School, Getting the Best from Mainstream Settings. Gareth, we're very pleased to have you join us.
Thank you very much, and I'm delighted to be here, as you say, from a very wet and cold North Wales in the UK. And I think it's fantastic the way that technology allows us to connect nowadays. And I want to say a special thank you really to a colleague who's online, Emily, who has kindly spent a lot of time talking to me over the last few years, and probably the reason that I'm able to speak to you today. So I want to just very briefly highlight the LASER approach, as was introduced. LASER stands for Low Arousal Supporting Educational Resilience, and this is very much about building resilience in the environment and the systems and the people for whom the young people interact with, be that in the home, be that on the transport to school or the educational setting or specialist provision that they are educated in, and in that setting itself. And it's looking at that whole child's experience through their whole day. And I think this is a really important consideration. And one thing before we whistle stop through some of the key elements, I think is really important. You know, I would never claim to be an expert in anything. I think I've been very fortunate through my own experience in schools and now working with lots of different schools globally to have some experiences that hopefully draw on some of the things that we've tried and tested and worked with that allow us then to have those critical conversations with other colleagues to create that systemic change. And this is hopefully what I'll share in the next 7 minutes or so. Could we have next slide, please? Fantastic. So the whole aim of it, the approach really, is about stress reduction. With a clear aim of eliminating restrictive practices, seclusion and the like, but very much looking at how we build this culture of inclusive practice and create this calm, consistent way of working. The key about the LASER approach is that it's developed in a way that can be sort of used to support young people wherever they receive education. So over the last 4 years, I've worked with young people who receive education individually in the home with parents or carers, for small specialist units of 2 or 3 young people, to specialist education settings, right through to mainstream international schools with 2,000 plus children. And it's about creating the systemic change that serves the community that setting is providing education for. And I think that's really important, this notion of personalization, as we talk through this session today. Could we have next slide, please? So in essence, there are 8 different elements to the LASER approach. And the key to this is a good analysis of the need that the setting or that family has at the start of any work that we'd be doing. And the core about this is really about identifying what are the priorities in the short term, the medium term, and the long term for those young people and families that we're looking at. And the reality is that some specialist settings would have a greater focus on eliminating restraint and seclusion, whereas some mainstream settings would have more of a focus on inclusive pedagogy, calm, consistent routines and structures, and understanding particularly the staff stress within those settings as well. The core about this really is being able to personalize that response to that individual community. And I think that's where it's really important to understand that notion of personalization within the model we're talking about today. Could we have next slide, please? A core part of this, as was mentioned by Tim earlier, is the saturation model. The saturation model is a model that I developed with colleagues Professor Neil Humphreys and Dr. Wendy Symes in the early 2000s. And in essence, this was a model that included autistic learners who had either been excluded from or weren't able to attend their mainstream schools in our community of schools that we were working with, and particularly the school of 1,300 young people that I was leading provision in. And in essence, this way of working allowed every single child we worked with over about a 15-year period to go on to education, employment, or training. So provided a pathway into adulthood for every single child. And I think it's really important to stress that, this was a real lived experience piece of work. If we could have next slide, please. And you can see a very simple little graph there. And I've also included in this slide deck and on a separate document we're hoping to get to you, lots of separate links that just break everything down really easy. But the key to this is about creating systemic change within that setting or that environment. And in essence, I've used this as a school improvement tool in many different places. I say quite fortunate to work with the British schools in Chile when they brought in inclusion legislation, as well as in Portugal over the last few years, and notably recently with some small provisions and individual schools in Glasgow, Norway and Sweden. If we have next slide, please. The core about this idea about educating the community for me is getting the peer group understanding 21st century children, the people that are there on their street, in their classrooms, the families that they are interacting with as part of that school community, but also the community in which they live. And I think this is where it's really important that our curriculum reflects that 21st century population. Next slide, please. One of the core elements to this work is working effectively and positively with families. This is what we would call co-production in the UK. And the real strength of this is that we would look at working with staff in schools, families and young people directly. And one of the benefits of the work I do is that I can be, on a playmat with a 5-year-old in Portugal 1 minute and talking to senior leaders in a group of schools in Norway the next. And it's about sharing those positive discussions and working together in identifying the challenges and finding the solutions. Next slide, please. And I think it's really important that we don't forget, as was said right at the beginning, that this is about young people and families. And Bobby is a young person who's now age 19 that I've had the benefit of working with. And it's really important that we understand there are real people in this that have actually had some great outcomes as a result of people changing their mindset and just being more proactive in their thinking. Next slide, please. And two colleagues and good friends of mine, I think, sum up exactly what this approach, the laser approach, is about, really. Rita talks about focus on harnessing strengths and allowing everybody to be the best they can become. And Damien, I think, sums up really my philosophy beautifully. It's about personalization, not normalization. It's not trying to park the problem in the child and force and fix. It's about looking at the environment and the people and allow individuals to flourish. Next slide, please. And so, as was mentioned on previous sessions, it's about coaching, supervision, ongoing support, etc., etc. Next slide, please. And part of the key things about this is that if you were interested in working with me, you would be working with me. So it is me, basically. So we'd be looking at maybe 1 or 2 schools or settings that would be interested in developing this way of working as a view of skilling people up to have conversations more locally with other schools. There's a book chapter we wrote on the approach there that you can download from the slides. Next slide, please. And unashamedly, there's the book that Debbie, who's a parent of autistic twins, and myself recently published, and I was delighted that Guy was be able to offer an endorsement to that, where we talk about working together in essence. There's tons of resources and free stuff that people can access in that as well. Next slide, please. And I just think, there's a lovely picture and a quote from a young lady called Lisa, who unfortunately is no longer with us as she had a lifelong limiting condition, but talked about how she got to do everything her friends do. It's just sometimes she has things changed a bit so she can join in properly. And I think really, if we don't believe we can make that difference, who does in essence? Next slide, please. So there's loads of links there, including some really powerful parental testimonies where we've worked with family groups, as well as other things and free webinars that we do. And if you would like to have a personal discussion about things, my email address is there, gareth@studio3.org. And I'm sorry if I've gone a bit over, but hopefully that makes some sense. And thank you very much again for the opportunity to speak to you.
Thank you very much, Gareth. That was great. You saw Guy Stevens mentioned in Gareth's presentation. Guy is our next presenter. Guy is the founder and executive director of the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint, otherwise known as AASR. This is a nonprofit they started in 2019. It is a community of over 30,000 parents, self-advocates, teachers, school administrators, paraprofessionals, attorneys, related service providers, and others working together to influence change in supporting children whose behavior is often misunderstood. AASR's mission is to inform changes in policy and practice, reduce and eliminate the use of punitive discipline and outdated behavioral management approaches, and end the school to prison pipeline. He's vice president of the board of directors of the ARC of Maryland. He's a member of the board of directors for PDA North America. He's presented at conferences and events across North America and guest lectures for both undergraduate and graduate education. Guy, we're really pleased to have you.
Tim, thank you very much for the introduction, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. So much, because this is really about doing better for not only our students, but for our teachers and our staff. And I'm a big believer that we have a lot of potential to do better. Before I get kind of started on my slides, I just want to say how amazing this is. I see, kind of through the presentation this morning, many friends and colleagues that are presenting and sharing with you the work that they do. And what I would say to you is that all of the people that are on this panel are people who are doing amazing work, and you certainly would not go wrong by working with any of them. That said, let me tell you a little bit about who the Alliance is, if we can go to the next slide, and tell you a little bit about our work and how I think we might be able to help in terms of this work to reduce and eliminate the use of timeout rooms. Tim kind of gave you my intro, which talks a little bit about who the Alliance is and why we formed. Really is at the heart of it is doing better for kids and doing better for teachers and staff, kids that are often misunderstood, kids that are often having behaviors that lead to a lot of punitive outcomes like restraint, seclusion, timeout, suspension, expulsion, all of these things that are often done to kids very often in the name of behavior. And again, we are driven by a strong approach and a strong ideology that we can do better here. Next slide. So a little bit about our work. At a high level, the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint, we're a national nonprofit, started about 5 years ago, started really because of a personal journey, which I would love to share with you more in a later time when we've got more time. But the work that we do is around legislation, education, and family support. We do a lot of work to influence changes in laws and policies, whether at a very local level, working with school districts, at a state level, or even at the federal level. We do a tremendous amount of work around education. How can we support change through training and presentations? And of course, we do family support as well as support for educators that are looking for help and support. One of the things I'm really proud of about our community is that we have a tremendous number of educators, administrators, related professionals, all that are driven by this idea that we can do better. Next slide. So in terms of our work, we do a lot of different things. I gave you kind of the overview, but this might look like presentations at national conferences or even international conferences, developing training. We worked previously with the University of California in Davis to develop specialized training for the university. We also do consulting work as well with schools and others. And we're doing some really interesting partnership work, which I don't have time to go into today, but we're actually right now partnering with the Crisis Prevention Institute in developing new training with them. So we do a kind of a broad, broad coverage of work there. Next slide. Our approach and our ideology is really, answering that question of how do we do better? What can we do to reduce and eliminate the use of timeout rooms or other punitive things that are often happening in schools? We believe at a high level in a trauma-informed, neuroscience-aligned, relationship-driven, and collaborative approach. We know more now about trauma and the impacts on the brain than we've ever known. Today, through neuroscience, we can understand behavior through a far different lens and understand that by understanding behavior differently, we can respond differently. And of course, at the heart of that are meaningful relationships and collaborating with kids rather than doing things to kids. How do we work with kids? Next slide. So I want to tell you a little bit about kind of our plan and where we might fit in. As I said, you would not go wrong with working with any of the professionals that you've heard from today. What I think that the Alliance can offer here that may be a little different is kind of a very high level overview. Depending on where you are and what your needs are, I see the process of doing this work as involving some discovery, some development, and of course, implementation. In my mind, that discovery begins with talking with school leaders and key staff. It involves understanding information on policies and data. It's about conducting staff research and really reaching out to stakeholders as well, families and parents and the community. So it begins with a bit of research and even potentially observational research to understand where things are, and then to make recommendations on developing plans based on that. So what we think we could do is help to develop a strategy for reducing the use of timeout rooms, creating really high quality professional development training plans, and developing methodologies to measure success, because we've always got to start by thinking about what success will look like. And then, of course, becomes implementation. And the Alliance is uniquely positioned to work with many professionals across the world, quite frankly, and help to figure out what's the right kind of training for your needs, and how can we not only offer training ourselves, but work with others to bring in others to develop training for your schools, for your districts to really make a change. So we see a role in helping to do that, and also helping collect feedback, making sure that we're on the right path, looking at our success metrics, and ultimately providing recommendations moving forward. Next slide. How can we help with this grant? So if you look at the implementation, if you look at the grant, there were 6 key areas mentioned. I'm not going to go through all of them, but as we looked at them, we believe there are 4 areas that we can offer support in helping to not only offer, but to coordinate high quality professional development. That's a role that we can help with. Implementing restorative practices. We work with a lot of professionals from across the world, and work with people that very specifically do a lot of amazing work related to restorative practices. And that's an opportunity for us to work with you. Of course, we are strongly connected with community groups and parent groups, and have really roots throughout the country, and a lot of amazing folks in Massachusetts that we work with. And of course, data collection. So we believe there's several areas within this opportunity that we can help support your work. Next slide. And I want to leave you here with 2 quick things. One, ultimately, all of this work is about how do we get better outcomes, not just for our kids, but for our teachers and staff. This is not being critical about the approaches that we're taking right now, but it's a matter of how do we take the information we have today and do better. I'm a huge proponent of this quote. I love Maya Angelou, but kind of the idea of do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. We have an opportunity here in Massachusetts. We know better. We have an opportunity to do better. We would love to help your schools do that. And next slide. And I'm just going to leave you here with my contact information. I would love to have conversations with individual schools, school districts, anyone that we might be able to assist as you're looking at this grant opportunity. And again, thank everyone, the organizers, the presenters, and all of you that have joined on this morning. I know you have many things on your plate, and appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Guy. And I want to thank all of the presenters for doing an impossible task, and that is addressing a very complex issue in essentially an elevator speech. But we wanted to give you, a overview of a lot of resources that are out there. And obviously there are many more, but I'm so glad that our final speaker is Dr. Ross Green. Dr. Green is a clinical psychologist. He's the originator of the innovative evidence-based approach called Collaborative and Proactive Solutions, CPS. And he's written many very influential books you're probably familiar with: The Explosive Child, Lost at School, Lost and Found, and Raising Human Beings. He also developed and directed and produced an award-winning documentary film, The Kids We Lose, which was released in 2018. Dr. Green was on the faculty at Harvard Medical School for over 20 years. He's now the founding director of the nonprofit Lives in the Balance. He's also an adjunct professor in the Department of Psychology at Virginia Tech, and an adjunct professor in the Faculty of Science at the University of Technology in Sydney, Australia. Dr. Green has worked with several thousand kids with concerning behaviors and their caregivers, and he and his colleagues have overseen implementation and evaluation of the CPS model in countless schools, inpatient psychiatric units, residential and juvenile facilities with dramatic effect. He's seen the significant reductions in discipline referrals, detentions, suspensions, and the use of restraint seclusion. Dr. Green lectures throughout the world and lives in Freeport, and we're very pleased to have you join us, Dr. Green. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. I am, that's Freeport, Maine, not Freeport in the Bahamas. I am very glad to be part of this very admirable and necessary initiative, and to be visiting with you all now. And I do want to thank Stephanie and Emily and Tim and Iman and Amanda for their hard work in making this possible. Let's go to the first slide. Here's the big issue as I see it. Should we be training staff on what to do as kids are becoming escalated, or once they're already escalated? Or should we instead be training staff on what to do so kids don't become escalated in the first place? If the answer is both, it's important to recognize that if staff are only being trained on what to do once kids are becoming escalated, then they're going to be doing that a lot because they're not addressing the factors that are causing the kids to become escalated in the first place. The collaborative and proactive solutions model is primarily focused on training staff on what to do so kids don't become escalated in the first place. It is not easy to help staff get out of crisis world, but it can be done, and it's very necessary. Next slide, please. Now, to make this point crystal clear, this graphic depicts the sequence of restraint and seclusion. And notice restraint and seclusion, or what in Massachusetts is called timeout, occurs at the end of a sequence. At the beginning of that sequence, or what we call early, or what we call true crisis prevention, is an expectation that a student is having difficulty meeting. Difficulty completing the double-digit division problems on the worksheet in math, difficulty sitting next to Susie during circle time. You name it, there's an expectation the kid is having difficulty meeting. That's the blue bubble. We call those unmet expectations unsolved problems. And if we are being truly proactive, we are identifying those problems and solving them proactively. Or, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, putting them on hold proactively. Expectations that are put on hold for now don't cause concerning behavior. And that's a very important part of stabilizing a kid and a classroom. Unfortunately, that's not what's going on in a lot of classrooms where kids are being restrained and or secluded. What's going on is red bubble number one, that is the prototypical adult first response to kids who are having difficulty meeting an expectation, insisting harder, pushing harder, which often sets in motion red bubble number two, a kid's concerning behavior. Something very important to notice, concerning behavior is late. The problem that's causing the concerning behavior already happened. That's what's early. Now in schools, I want to go back to red bubble number one just briefly. In schools, there are a lot of interventions that educators employ that are still a form of insisting harder, finding the right entry point, adapting, accommodating, strategizing. We have to recognize that even when we're doing those things with the best of intentions, we are still insisting that a kid meet an expectation that they're having difficulty meeting. And there's an excellent chance we are still causing concerning behavior. Now, in the collaborative and proactive solutions model, we view that concerning behavior as the kid's frustration response. And if it is a big frustration response, it could be dangerous, it could be scary. And that's what leads us to red bubble number three, de-escalating. I want you to notice something very important about de-escalating. While it's important in some instances, it's also very late. If it's very late, you're not in crisis prevention mode. You're in crisis management mode. And of course, when de-escalating doesn't get the job done, what happens next? In many schools, a restraint, seclusion, timeout. That's the sequence. When you are working with us, you are in the blue bubble. That's what we work with schools on. So let's put the next slide up and I'll talk a little bit about the blue bubble. At a very practical level, here's what we help school staff learn how to do. We teach them to proactively identify the problems that are causing a child's frustration responses. We teach them to proactively prioritize their expectations so they're not working on everything at once and they're not putting expectations on kids that we already know the kid can't meet. We call that expectation management. We fervently believe that the more expectation management staff are doing, the less behavior management staff are going to need to be doing. And we help staff learn how to solve those problems collaboratively, meaning with the full engagement of the student, and proactively, meaning outside the heat of the moment. We have some very impressive data, and just very briefly, I'm just giving you a sampling here. Next slide, please. These are data from a school system in Maine, not too far from here, 3 classrooms where they were using all of their restraints and seclusions. They saw a dramatic reduction. I think they're close to 0 at this point with implementation of collaborative and proactive solutions. Next slide, please. These are data from the largest school system in Virginia. As you can see, they were doing thousands of restraints and seclusions every year upon implementation of the CPS model. They too are close to 0 at this point. Next slide, please. Let me just close by saying that we do this work with many, many schools all over the world, including many in Massachusetts. We know the kids, we know how difficult they can be. We know the staff, we know the pressures schools are under. We know how hard the work is, and we know that the work doesn't need to be as hard as it is. We know that every school and classroom is unique, and just as we do with kids, we are going to meet you where you're at. We are in the trenches with you. We are quite confident that we can help you eliminate the use of timeout rooms without compromising safety and without increasing the use of restraint or police referrals. We would welcome the opportunity to work with you and to provide your staff with a very positive learning experience. I'm eager to talk with you about your specific needs, delighted to connect you with leaders of other schools that we have worked with, and our Massachusetts-based trainers are chomping at the bit to work with you. Thank you.
We want Go ahead, Iman.
We want to thank everyone for coming, and we want to respect your time. We wanted to have questions, but as you can see, it's 10 o'clock exactly. So please feel free to put any questions you have in the chat, and I'll make sure to connect you with vendors. If you have very specific questions to a vendor or general questions, we'll make sure that those are answered through email. So please feel free to put any of your burning questions into the chat, and I'll have Stephanie give us some closing remarks.
Thank you all for coming. The presenters are just a wealth of knowledge, and I feel so grateful for their time as well as all of the participants' time. And I really feel that this grant is an opportunity for schools to get support to make these transitions in approach, and that it is helpful for the children and the staff as a whole. So feel free to reach out to any of the presenters, or you can contact me directly with any follow-up questions. And everyone who attended will get a recording as well as a copy of the slides. And feel free to share this widely. We are hoping to get this word out as widely as we can. And again, thank you so much for attending.